I was recently asked to give a talk for the English language teachers in Jakarta, and the topic was the responsible use of AI. And it was such an enjoyable conversation. I thought I would record the lecture and share it and see what your thoughts are. So, the question of the responsible use of AI in the classroom is one that is becoming more and more urgent. Um, but I don't think there is a responsible way to use AI for pedagogy. And I suppose this makes me old-fashioned, but I'm fine with that. So let me try to say why I think that's the case. I think you would have to approach this question by deciding what you meant by pedagogy or what you meant or understood by the idea of having learned something. Another way to put this would be to ask the question, well, how would you know that pedagogy had happened? Are there reliable signs and indicators that one would point to? And this has, of course, been studied extensively, and I'm not going to rehearse all that here. But we can perhaps agree that in language learning, we can say that pedagogy has happened when a part of language has been learned and can be used. Um, for example, somebody knows how to decline irregular verbs or something like that, conjugations. So you have learned English when you can actually read, speak, and comprehend that language. One does not have to have mastered English to say that one has learned it, but one does have to claim a certain level of competency. And again, there are all kinds of measures for this competency. The IELTS exam is probably the most well recognized. So, what I want you to imagine is somebody using AI on their phone or their laptop to get a high score on IELTS. Would that be a measure of their proficiency in English? And I think the answer to that is obviously no. And you can extend this example by thinking about somebody using AI to pass their medical exam and then asking yourself whether or not you would trust that particular doctor to diagnose your health conditions. So now imagine that the exam is carried out and assessed by AI. Could we rely on its results? Would we rely on its capacity to assess whether a human or even a human using AI was proficient in English? And again, I don't think so because real competence is often measured by the capacity to handle irregularity. For example, I often find when I'm talking to people whose first language is not English, in fact, it might be their third language, that I kind of have to guess what they're saying. So, in a way, my competence in English is measured by my capacity to handle their incompetence in English. And so, in other words, it's not my capacity to know what should regularly happen, but rather to be able to deal with irregularity. So, I'm able to make sense of what people say because I can apprehend the variability, to use Deleuze's concept, built into what they say. So, variability, as Deleuze explains, can be measured like this. How much can something be varied before it ceases to be recognizable as that thing? Now, English has a very high tolerance for variability, and probably one of the reasons for this is that it has a very large number of speakers for whom English is not their first language. So it's kind of a mutant language that has incorporated a great many other languages along the way. So in some ways, the best test of competency in English is not to ask someone to determine if a language construction is right or wrong, but rather to ask them to determine the meaning of something we know is wrong. And so consider the opening stanza of E. Cummins' famous poem, Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town. The poem goes like this: Anyone lived in a pretty how town with up so floating many bells down. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, he sang his didn't and he danced his did. Now, this poem is routinely held up as an example of nonsense poetry and of absurdism, but also of genius. Now, if AI wrote it, we'd think that there was something wrong with the program. If a student wrote it, we'd mark them down for getting their English muddled. And yet we can make sense of the poem if we are competent enough, if we can tolerate variability and we can work with it. Now, I've gotten off on a bit of a tangent here, so let me bring it back to my original question, which was, how do we know when pedagogy has taken place? How do we determine if someone is competent or not? Now, this question has become urgent and important in a way no one really anticipated 10 or 20 years ago. No one thought, what will we do if computers just write the assessments for students? We've gotten used to detecting plagiarism, and we've developed pretty good techniques for spotting it when it happens. And since Google reads and indexes the entire internet, if someone copies something from the internet, it can usually be spotted. And this is not infallible, but it's certainly makes it much harder to just simply copy and paste. But AI is different. It isn't copying, it's creating pastiches on demand. It's still a version of copying, but one that is much harder to spot. The AI systems created to detect the presence of AI productions have so far been disappointing in their results. And interestingly, they tend to produce very high numbers of false positives. They think more cheating is going on than is actually the case. And this possibly says something about why AI is possible, because so much of what we write and say is structured by the built-in redundancies of our language. I guess what I'm trying to say then is that I think we can say learning has taken place if we can satisfy two factors. First of all, technical proficiency can be demonstrated, but also that technical proficiency is demonstrated via creativity. So the question is, why would we want AI in our classrooms if it can't really achieve these things? Um, so let's get back to the question. If students are using AI in their assessments, are they learning anything? And as I said, I think the answer to this is clearly no. They're not learning anything if the AI system does the work for them. And we could obviously test this by assessing the students who don't have access to AI and so on. But I think there are two questions here that are worth further consideration. And the first one is, why would students want to use AI? Surely they cannot be unaware that if AI is doing the work for them, then they're not learning anything. If students know they're not learning anything by using AI, then that means they don't see learning as a priority. And I assume they're prioritizing good grades over actual learning, which is a structural fault in our education system. We think grades measure learning, but in the era of AI, this is no longer the case. Grades measure AI's capacity to replicate a certain model of thinking and writing. People are worried that we need to change assessment practices in order to prevent people from cheating, but I think there is a much bigger problem here. We need to change our assessment practices so that they encourage learning. And of course, this is an age-old debate, and it's not in any way new. But I think it has taken on a new kind of urgency because the capacity for students to cheat has gone up exponentially. And this will require a major change in how we think about education. How do we reward competency without reducing it to a grade? I.e., how do we measure it without measuring it? Of course, there are probably students who aren't aware that they're using that by using AI they aren't learning anything. And this is a very different kind of a problem. These students view learning in terms of their capability to use a machine. They equate their know-how or technical proficiency in getting a machine to do a piece of work for them with the acquisition of knowledge. So, in other words, they don't regard the content that they're dealing with as knowledge. They regard their capacity to produce that content using the machine as knowledge. And this is a kind of existential problem in some ways because it stems from a worldview in which everything, i.e., every form of experience, is and should be mediated via screen. So we've reached an era in which people tend to take the view that you shouldn't talk to them when you could send a text and don't send a text if you could post on Instagram and so on. Nowadays, we tend to follow trends, collect likes, pose for selfies, and so on. So there's a trend away from a certain old model of face-to-face communication. So what's really going on here, which is replicated in classroom, is active forms of imagining, thinking, and creating are being replaced by passive forms. As such, as teachers, we're more worried about students being bored in class than we actually are worried about teaching them. In the process, though, we've substituted entertainment for education. Sometimes learning is boring. The mistake, I think, is to assume that boredom is an impediment to learning. And again, there's a huge debate about this. But I think that the way that we've treated boredom as something that has to be rigorously avoided has come at a very high cost, because now we've created a situation in which if students aren't entertained, they don't seem to be able to focus. But if they're being entertained, they're not necessarily learning. And I would suggest that being bored isn't an impediment to learning. I can remember being bored many a time, many things that I had to learn, but still learned them. So it's students' inability to persevere in the face of boredom that is the problem. Um, and that is something that's encouraged by a life mediated through screens, because they never have to be bored. They have a constant source of passive stimulation. So we tend to discourage students from developing the resources to become resilient and determined and disciplined and goal oriented, all attributes that we prize in the face of boredom. And instead, we encourage the attributes we give them in order to entertain them. But what is it that makes learning boring? How can new knowledge and new capabilities ever be boring? And I suspect the answer is students have no idea what they'll do with the knowledge. In part, this is because they expect machines to do the work for them into the future. But I think the deeper problem is that they don't see themselves as transformed by knowledge. And here I'm thinking of the 19th century novel known in German as the Bildungsroman, the novel of transformation. The novel reflected the fashion at the time for improving oneself via education. And this is, of course, highly problematic because, the idea of improving was transported into the sort of colonial situation where it meant that colonized people were meant to somehow become like their colonizing masters. So I'm not advocating for it. But what I'm trying to say is that the idea that education can be transformational in a personal sense seems to be an idea that has been lost in favor of education being something that equips you for a particular kind of a job. So under the old Bildungsroman model, literature was assigned on the basis that it would be improving rather than because it was interesting or considered aesthetically remarkable. The works were considered improving because they raised moral and ethical dilemmas that were thought to be useful in shaping the young minds of the future ruling class. Now, we no longer think in such terms. We don't even think about the possibility that students may be improved by what they learn and by what they are exposed to. Students in the era of the Bildungsroman would not have even been tempted by AI because they would recognize that it had no improving value for them. Now, improving doesn't just mean learning, it means recognizing and embracing the idea that knowing things is transformational. And today's students question the value of all knowledge and measure that value in terms of whether or not they'll use it in future employment. As such, they tend to devalue in advance almost all forms of knowledge that they encounter in the classroom. When knowledge is devalued in advance, then of course students will have no problem using AI to do their assessments. They don't care that they're not learning anything because they don't regard what they're supposed to learn as intrinsically valuable. And the more that government, the university, industry, and so on prioritize so-called employable skills, the harder they make it for teachers to actually teach their students anything. That's because employable is a highly selective way of looking at knowledge. It ultimately deems most forms of knowledge to be irrelevant. If you're going to work in a bank, you don't need to know Shakespeare, but maybe by knowing Shakespeare, you'll be a better person. So the use of AI just compounds and accelerates this trend towards the devaluation of all values. So for that reason, among many others, I think there is no responsible use of AI in the classroom.